Hello everyone, today we talk about Conrad II the Salian, life and times. Actually, it's just an introduction about the figure and Germany, Italy and Burgundy in his own time. We will talk about him further because actually there is a lot about his figure that deserves also international relations great attention. At this point, European history is pretty interconnected at a level that surely the Holy Roman Empire embodies pretty well, like in its centrality and especially considering the specific lands it encompassed, etc. And we may even come to a point which we will make a proper biography of individuals. I think I did this just once with like either Frederick II of Hohenstaufen, but it was very early on, so it was a naturally simplified thing. The same goes for High-Stulf of the Longobards. Today we try to just give an idea of what that time empire was really about, and a bit of the figure of Conrad himself, right? So, as you know, this is Conrad II was the first of the Salians. So he came, the Salian dynasty, so the one that ruled between the Ottonians and the Hohenstaufen, the Franconian dynasties. And the Ottonians, Saxons, and partly Franconians, because actually Franconia, as you know, was the so was called like this because in a sense it kind of had inherited by culture and early colonization of Germany from the side of the Franks. That's basically the land that had inherited the greatest Carolingian, properly Frankish grandeur, right? Not even you see, the Carolingians were Austrasians. They came from slightly different places, but Franconia was the most Frankicized, perceived as such. Were fairly wealthy land in the. It's difficult to, I would say, the center of Germany, rather, of course, central western. Some say south, but properly was fairly advanced. We'll see what Germany was about in this time. And the Ottonians, as you know, we talk a lot about them, so there's even a playlist dedicated to them, so if you're interested, we just began to scratch the surface, but it can serve as an introduction, where the great dynasty of the Renovatio Imperii, so much that historiography a bit imprecisely says that the Holy Roman Empire was born with the Ottonians. This is actually completely wrong, right? It was always the same empire from Carolingian times, without any discontinuity. They would have been very surprised to think that they had created the Holy Roman Empire, right? This is just a bit of a bias because of reasons that are a bit political or, now we can't discuss. But surely it's a time in Holy Roman Imperial history proper at this point, because they stand also with the didactic division. I don't talk about Holy Roman Empire for Charlemagne, for that matter. But here it's like Byzantine, right? We identify this more precise. It's not Frank, it's Germany plus Italy fundamentally, and other surrounding lands. They came with this important and burdensome legacy at their back, right? Because Otto III in 1002 had died without heirs. Henry II as well, without issue in 1024, right? Otto III had not been married, right? And however, being young at this time, was thought, okay, he will probably get married and produce children, while he actually died of malaria in Italy when he was only 21. Henry II, that was, as you know, the basically the Bavarian branch of the Ottonians, what also this important shift in German heirs of power had produced, had been married for a long time, like 30 years, but he had died when he was 50. And not having had issue, we are prone to think that at least the German aristocracy would have said, okay, next when he dies, this will be a problem because we have to find, if anything, a heir. You can imagine the nuisance, the ambition, the competition, etc. Instead, there is this account from Vipo, this is the Italian monk that wrote the Gesta Conradi about Conrad, who describes 20 years later by the impression that at Henry II's death, on July the 13th, 1024, the German aristocracy that had been summoned to Kamba on the Rhine, which is a place that today is seemingly submerged by the river. It's closer to another village, and it doesn't exist anymore practically. Well, they for the election of a new king there, as it happened, by Archbishop Aribo of Mainz, who was the primate of Germany, right? Because of the Mainz archdiocese that represents in the empire fundamentally Germany, whereas Trier does with France and Cologne with Italy. So he describes the situation as if properly, the aristocracy had just began at that point, at the death of the sovereign, to think of who had to succeed. And actually, here it's a bit of a genealogical history we should make, but we can kind of skip it. But let's say all this aristocracy in the kingdom was, in the kingdom of Eastern France, was a bit of, all the same blood, right? From different branches, but still they shared some. So there were many, and maybe not so obvious. In fact, it wasn't such an obvious choice of who had to succeed, also considering that the principle was mostly elective at this point. Actually, Salian times would mark exactly this emphasis, especially later on with the struggle for investitures when, imperial authority royal authority starting to be more challenged properly on an institutional, juridical level rather than just a political one, from a practical point of view. Who had to be elected. Up to this point, it had been more of a dynastic matter than is usually conceived, even though the German ethnic duchies were still said to have been kind of a broader, like all different countries scattered, but still there was a more of a dynastic, maybe privatistic principle around which the elites naturally had built also this idea that properly of the Teutonic kingdom that was a recent creation, ideally speaking. So there were basically two men, right? Both by the name of Conrad. They were cousins with each other. One called the younger, the other the elder. Conrad II was the elder and was elected king on that occasion. Wippos says in his account that he was an idiota in Latin, that he's an illiterate. He couldn't write. And surely by the Italian monks' standards, this wasn't very flattering, because as we'll see now, Italian politics and say juridical practice, literacy, etc., was a completely different situation from north of the Alps. So it was something that he felt the need to point out, right? But still, the German electors thought otherwise. They thought he was the most suitable candidate. And what Wipo, in fact, fails to mention is that Conrad had a bloodline an Ottonian legacy, because he was basically the great-grandson of Otto the First, daughter Luthgard, right? Also descending from the his English wife Edith, right? And therefore he was actually the closest of kin to the deceased king. And we don't have to be surprised by Wipo's omission, because, of course, at the time, it was a memory who had been an emperor, who not. We'll see also with the fact that Conrad was named Conrad II, because they remembered there had been a lesser figure that still was king of Eastern France at the beginning of the 10th century, being Conrad. And we've seen it also in the video we recently made about Alemannia and Alpine Rhaetia. But as far as the genealogies of noble families, well, these were not usually written down. Nor in Germany, those were at hand, right? But surely they knew, right? Because the dynastic connections to the lineage were very important. These people were very high elite, right, for those times and places. So Conrad the Elder was chosen, let's say, with a sort probably of mixed reason of contingental necessity, but also possibly this dynastic this dynastic element, right? Historiography is a bit divided on this because they can't understand what's behind the rise of this new royal house coming from Franconia. It wasn't an easy reign, by the way, because the Saxons basically remained neutral, as we will see to this election. The Lotharingians were probably also opposed, right? But we know that Conrad's chancery, for example, was perfectly aware, together with the sovereign, that there had been the first Conrad in ruling between 911 and 19. Right? So, first Salian king called himself Conrad II, from the Salians, the Salia. So this dynasty is very important and somewhat overlooked historically for a bit of bias and mostly the problems, I guess, deriving from the struggle for investitures and the general instability of the kingdom that began to be seen at that point. Eventually, the Swabians would give a bit of more chance to the idea of creating something like a national monarchy in Germany, but they didn't succeed either, so things went downhill again after. But surely the Salians, of course also the Ottonians before, had set some precedent for the strengthening of the institutional profile. Conrad ruled from 1024 to 1039. His son Henry III from up to 1056. He died fairly young, at 39 years old, so he was followed by his son Henry IV up to 1105 and 6, right? Which is fascinating because at the time he accessed to the throne, he was just 5 years old. In that case, this problem of minority had been an issue at the time of Otto III, also recently before Conrad, etc. Mostly, Henry IV is famous, in fact, for the humiliation of canals of the stormy reign, etc. He was deposed by his own son Henry V, who ruled between 1105 and 1125, basically. This would be the last of the Salians, as basically he had no children with his wife Matilda, who came back to England, where she was from, with no children, as being called the Emperor's Mode in British tradition. Let's say Conrad II and Henry III reigned in a kind of still institutionally within the boundaries of the institutional customs of the time, right? Henry IV posed faced with more problems, and this surely has to do with the Gregorian reform. That was something which gave the other princes of the empire the chance to rebel, particularly the Saxons in that case. There's probably also a political geography that starts being outlined in German history at this point, with properly it's not a few for the Saxons, for example, that another dynasty would properly rise to the throne, at least, as we've seen, the same Conrad descended from the Ottonians, but still had his power in other areas of Germany, right? And Henry IV's reign is considered a bit like the crisis of medieval Germany, it's, however, something very complicated sometimes to explain, because the governability of the kingdom in the first place wasn't that florid ever since, but let's say, but not even from before. So in any case, this crisis continued under the reign of Henry V. Paradoxically, the rise of the Hohenstaufen occurred exactly in this context of crisis, and if you want, of autonomization of the local powers. The Swabians here kept, we've seen it before in the video about Alemannia/Swabia, how they tried to escape a bit this centripetal force of centralization, but still framed within properly the not in a sense of ethnic descent, properly within a competition now within the same political and institutional system of the reign and of the empire, right? Also, in Conrad's time, there was nothing like a proper formal procedure in the imperial in the royal election specifically. Because unlike it would happen very late in time, by the 14th century, there was no fixed defined body of electors or counting votes, right? So it was, a candidate had mostly to prove to have the support of a certain amount of following that would, in a given place, accept and formally recognize his fitness for the office, right, properly as a person, and this would be enough for essentially accepting. This would come as a it was a mix like of properly of a people's custom, but especially of divine will, and this dichotomy, albeit blurred, was a bit also the world deal, not just in Germany but many other countries say, okay, who is that decides? Is it the law of the land, or is it God's will, right? And how are these connected? So this is not the time to discuss it, but we'll surely do at some point. There was probably, however, at this time a bit more of bias for the latter. That is to say, divine will was taken very seriously. Here we don't have time to digress on what properly the idea of empire, right? Aside from whether we're talking about properly the royal imperial title was about, how the Eastern Franks had interiorized from I don't know, from migration era, from the pagan background, what properly a rule had to be. This was these were times of iron and blood, right? So the idea that somebody would be elevated in the first place into this messy world as to the throne as as a proof of some kind of authority, stability, of capacity, was seen as something, matching the expectations of a God-given ruler, in a sense, aside from the concrete nuisance of needing properly to govern the land that are a bit more prosaic in this regard. And naturally, there was a lot of reliance of these kings on properly their subjects. But with the Ottonians, there was properly no state. The Ottonians controlled territorially just basically Saxony and Franconia. The rest was just their rule floating over a series of communities, of principalities, of bishoprics, etc., scattered all over the empire, that had all the interest to, there was always a pro-imperial, anti-imperial party already, that would say, okay, if we support this guy, we can use him against our opponents, and this would give all a series of direction. Famously, even in the same creation of the idea of the empire, that by the 10th century now had taken a very specific character from very characteristic profile. Let's say from Carolingian times, was something, for example, much more, I would say, Roman in nature, ideally, than it was before. It was much more concerned with intervention in ecclesiastical policy, for example. This is typical of the Ottonians. So at this point, monarchy was trying to enforce further these ideas, but still having to confront with the tolerance of the various communities of the empire, that in many cases, most cases, always were very jealous of their customs, of their rights, their prerogatives. And in fact, simply rendering homage, literally, to Conrad at Kamba, where the election took place from the side of the nobility, did not dispense the king from seeking the support of those, for example, who had not been present there. And importantly enough, as we were recalling before, the Saxons, right, that were seemingly completely absent. So properly showing that they weren't particularly happy about this choice. The new king was essentially of Frankish background, because Conrad's family owned a lot of wealth, essentially in the Rhineland around Worms and Speyer, which is another world from Saxony, right? And therefore, it doesn't matter what his blood was about, he was still considered by the Saxons as a foreign king, right? But for the time being, the Saxons were just content with this king guaranteeing their own law that the historian Ripa says, it was particularly cruel, the particularly cruel Saxon law, which Conrad did. They agreed on when he met during his tour of the realm with the Saxons at the town of Minden. Because at this point, consider also that courts were itinerant, and it was a particular type of, mean of strengthening their political and strategical situation, right? To properly move and to find, as we were saying before, it's as if they literally floated in these communities, and they was a chance to tie them as a clientele to deal with things more from concretely from a local level, as broader administrative structures basically lacked, right? So here you see an interesting pattern already, considering that the Saxons as something different, right? Something whose law was, as according to Vippa, particularly cruel, right? And depicting a reality that probably was different from an ethnic point of view from other areas of Germany. What was Germany at the time? Well, Germany was a very archaic kingdom, right? Under all points of view, economically, socioeconomically, politically, intellectually, right? It was a thinly populated land, was crossed by these huge stretches of woods, uncultivated swamps or heaths that had historically divided and created a bit also, not primarily the various ethnical identities of the powers that still, Germans actually in part live into as a mindset today, right? As different countries proper in a federal sense. But this is a legacy of the time. So as a consequence, it was very difficult to keep these things together, properly to travel across Germany, right? To communicate, to organize things on a large scale, coordinated fashion. The main routes in this sense were not surprisingly the main rivers, the navigable rivers that also in Germany take only certain, can allow just to take certain directions, especially if you are based on in a very specific area. Also, trade resented naturally this, lack of infrastructures, etc. In fact, the same trade and manufacture were a minor economic factor in the Eastern Frankish kingdom compared naturally to the most extensively practiced agriculture. There was probably at this time not much of a diversified economy, right? It was just, towns, villages, concentrated on farming, but pretty much it. Also, and importantly, already at this point, basically the overwhelming majority of Germans lived and worked under the control of a lord, right? Whether it be ecclesiastical, where in Germany was also very important, or secular, right? So the process of privatization or aristocratization of culture from say, migration era times had dramatically gone in favor of the aristocracies, of the oligarchy. So when you read about the rights of these people, it was obviously what the nobility thought about that. The others had been, sometimes even very harshly brought under, right? Think about the Stellinger Revolt or other episodes that were not very far history by certain standards. The most important centers were the ones of Roman origin, naturally, on the Rhine, on the Danube, that were mostly bishoprics at the time, right? They depended upon their lords, were bishops or archbishops, whereas the majority of people lived in the hamlets around the manors, right? Literacy also was very low. The only literate people basically were and centers of learning were in big monasteries, There were some teachers who in the cities gathered a few students under initiative or that of the bishops, but it was so something very minor. This situation was very different in Conrad's second kingdom, that is the Italian one, the Italic one. As you know, the imperial tradition required properly for the conferment of the imperial title, the connection of the Kingdom of Germany and the one of Italy. Technically, in the Holy Roman Empire, the Italic kingdom was the most important institutionally, because without that properly, you couldn't take the imperial crown, right? Eventually, yes, it was mostly starting from Germany, as king of Germany, then king of the Romans, so the would-be emperor, and then you had to go to Rome to be crowned emperor. But before, you had to be crowned king of Italy, and therefore, there were other emperors that were not German. They were Provençal, they were Italian, etc. They wouldn't need the German crown. So the only one was properly the Italic one for essentially the imperial idea that was the kingdom that contained, at least from an imperial perspective, Rome. Right? The popes thought of it very differently, because the popes thought that the church was not under anybody. Ideally, the Patrimonium Sancti Petri specifically was a kind of a non-reality. It was God's possession, right? So they thought that institutionally it wasn't within the Italian boundaries, whereas the German emperors did, because that gave them the possibility to stress the fact that they controlled, like it had been now in the wake of the Teutonic tradition, also the same church as emperors, albeit the canons didn't say anything regarding that, and this is all the matter of the struggle for investitures of the Gregorian reforms. But it's interesting that also broader moral problems that had been stressed to justify this imperial ecclesiastical policy were actually an imperial creation, so that the Gregorian reforms actually appropriated itself of the same in order to essentially to back the papal prerogatives. And the thing is more complicated than it seems. But still, speaking of the Kingdom of Italy, this was the Regnum Italiae proper in Latin. It was roughly, it was basically what the Longobards had created as such, right? And the Carolingians had conquered, and therefore it encompassed almost all northern and central Italy. But by Conrad's time, fundamentally the core, as it had been also historically in the past, of the kingdom proper, what would confer de facto the control, right, of the crown, was more or less Lombardy, right, narrowly meant. That is to say, properly the Po Valley, except northeastern Italy, right, without the coastal line. So this broader flatland, crossed by important rivers, populated by an important amount, a lot of cities, traffic, etc. So it was the most important area that would confer, if controlled, and this started being a problem, especially from these times onwards, albeit it had already been previously the main deal of. As you know, the Germans had tried to curb the last attempt of properly the Italic aristocracy to rise with a properly Italian monarchy and empire, right? Exactly under Henry II. The attempts had been curbed. So from this time on, the nobility was brought down, and especially the cities were rising. And what we start seeing as fundamentally the communes, that would actually render things much more difficult to the Germans than the nobility had done. And this is something that we start seeing now, very ferocious movements that taken place in the Italian cities against properly imperial rule, for reasons that even today we can't discuss properly, because we should make a video about properly the Ottonian ecclesiastical policy. Actually, in part we already did, right? But these events here we frame just in the broader picture of Conrad's times, life and times, and they're actually much more complicated. An important difference with Germany is that the Italian inhabitants were considered free by birth, right? This is a huge deal, whereas in the north, as we've seen, they were basically all somebody's client in a way or not. Here traditions stood differently. Nobility also continued to reside in towns. On the contrary, there was an increasing urbanization of the nobility and rise of cities at the same time. And the Lombard inhabitants especially of the cities, were in such powerful state that they could essentially refute the dominion by their bishops and or other lords. That would become the big deal in here, especially considering that the appointment of bishops had been a very specific feature of imperial policy in Ottonian times, right? Because they could appoint them without, actually recognizing the bishops the local bishops were already in place, but still reinforcing their position over the towns. Now the towns were, over the city population. Now the city population was, together with the nobility, by the way, the communes were properly born also through the nobility, and it were the makers of the thing, against the bishop, and therefore its imperial support. It was never a thing like Italy versus Germany, but it's obvious that being this another kingdom, speaking another language, living in another, from the other side of the Alps, with other traditions, other mechanisms, other, properly also more resources than in the north, things started becoming more apparently uncontrollable, right? Than they had been before, right? In fact, famously enough, at the death of Henry II, the inhabitants of Pavia, that was traditionally the capital of the Italic kingdom all throughout Longobard, Carolingian, and Ottonian times, the imperial palace had been destroyed. And this was an evident symbol of the disappointment of the local population towards the interference of imperial authority in the appointment of the Rome government. These revolts happened in other centers as well, at least in terms of challenge towards the government of their respective episcopal lords, such as in Cremona, Brescia, Parma, Lodi. So all big, important cities. Right here, the important is the city. Sometimes in historiography, you find these places called as towns. These were not towns. These were civitates, which is something that, for instance, elsewhere it really didn't exist, especially in terms properly as a political military community identified by urbanization, by the idea that the word that city, those walls, that trade, those traffics, that increasing control in the countryside, that were starting to make the difference. Something unknown in the rest of European civilization. It was developing only there. And this cultural divide was very difficult to overcome. Right? This would be evident, especially later on, when things had completely gotten out of hand, especially after the struggle for investitures, the first one. The Italian kingdom had basically gone, its own way compared to eventually German emperors tried to reassert their control in a world that they basically didn't recognize anymore, or that maybe never quite connected themselves with. These centers saw the destruction of their lords' city palaces as well, just as in Pavia, because it was a model. These areas were very interconnected. Like what one city did, the others did as well. There are strikingly contemporary developments in these political institutional forms of administration. That tells you how interconnected, how fluid, how thriving this region properly was. In Germany, it was nothing like that, by any stretch of the imagination. And Conrad naturally denounced this act of violence. These people had destroyed the symbol of public and of imperial authority, right? They demanded the reconstruction. Conrad demanded the reconstruction of the palace in Pavia. Of course, this didn't take place, and this surely reveals what the divides were starting to be. Right, the rise of these cities couldn't be reconciled properly with a fully feudal background of views that the emperor himself owned. Right. What was happening in Italy would have changed the whole Western Europe just in a few decades to come. Simply, like for also what happened in other countries, even from Germany, even if it was happening in Burgundy, it wasn't understood, wasn't perceived. Simply, their society wasn't capable to grip on these issues. Right, at that point it was just, imperial authority being recognized or not, right? And it was always about a negotiation at the end of the day. And now things started, without even a proper center, to be even more complicated, because it was easier to deal with a nobility than with all these cities evolving into eventually city-states, in a sense, proper. But naturally it took some time. Burgundy, we named Burgundy because this land was acquired under Conrad's time, right? And the thing brought to some concern also for the German aristocracy, because as now the emperor becomes too powerful. There were also increasing accusations in the moral temper of the time. We'll see better in the ecclesiastical policy of some venial saints such as Simony, etc. Story goes, basically, Rudolf III of Burgundy, the king of Burgundy. It was another kingdom, properly within the empire, because the empire wasn't just about Germany or Italy. That's what we were saying before. The empire was everything that had laid into the Carolingian lands, right? The Western Frankish kingdom, ideally, was part of the empire. Like also in the Middle Age, even the early modern age, sometimes French kings tried to be elected as Holy Roman Emperors, because technically, this was a universal crown, right? Burgundy was specifically, but it was a kingdom that wouldn't make it much at the end of the day. And in fact, Conrad's time showed this in terms of, Rudolf III had remained without issue. And already he had been a liege and as well as relative of Henry II already back in the day. So the Eastern Frankish kings had already mediated this integration of Burgundy further under their control. Rudolf died in September 1032, and Conrad claimed the Burgundian crown as Henry II's heir in the office of king, specifically. So it was properly a royal matter, not even an imperial one at that point. There was some trouble because of this, because Rudolf's nephew, Count Otto of Blois, as well as Conrad's stepson, the Duke of Swabia, Ernest, claimed Burgundy. Because they were as the closest kin and heirs to the deceased, right? So this brought actually to war. Also in Swabia, at the end of the day, the rebels would be defeated. Conrad prevailed, and he would be crowned King of Burgundy in February 1033. Factually, as we were saying before, the Burgundian crown was just an honor. Like the Burgundian feudal lords at that point were taking over properly the kingdom, and that's why it disgregated. So Conrad owned the Burgundian crown as a dignitas, right? And nothing more concretely. Yet, this acquisition is very important because henceforth, Burgundy was to be considered to be part of the Imperium, right? The lands of the Imperator. So there is this further increase in the concept of territorialization of imperial power that before was something much more fluid, right? So this is a gradual step in a broader perspective towards, the creation of a more territorial power rather than just an ideal of an empire floating in the air with some falling with the military glory on somebody's head, right, and to be appointed emperor. They were searching naturally to expand their assets and to secure them from a proper point of view, but it was very difficult. As far as Conrad was concerned, especially by Ottonian custom, the regnum and sacerdotium were bound to each other. They had a mutual responsibility. They had been ordained so by divine will, especially in north of the Alps. There wasn't much of a difference proper between, let's say, a lay and a clergyman's life at all levels, from the elites, especially in Germany. As you know, the ecclesiastical ones were pretty warlike, to even properly the lesser people. We've seen it in that video we made recently about the, essentially chastity, as it was addressed in the Gregorian reforms a few generations after this period. Conrad was the Lord's anointed. So, but by this sacralized self, like he thought to be responsible for the Christian faith and the Christian churches of his realms altogether. Right, and the habitual way to cope with ecclesiastical policy, like with lay one, was about a patronage, right? Clientels, donations, intervention, as we've seen, also very contingential, literally, going one place with its courtier rather than another, all these things. And this naturally was aimed at gaining the support of the local communities. Bishops and abbots behaving like landlords, so that meant tying their assets to the imperial cause or not, right? So it was still naturally believed at the time, it was the normality, it was the practice of a world without a state, as always had been. So it was seen in a both spiritual and material way, like the way. There weren't many other ways, indeed. Indeed, however, this ecclesiastical policy was starting to be properly criticized from a moralistic point of view, naturally for political interests, from the same clerics and monks. That is to say, how should, let's say, an anointed king behave with the church that is properly not an earthly thing, right? This is how the problem had begun, right? Of course, the church stood like with people and goods, etc., in the physical world, in the earth, and the emperor was meant to rule, sovereign on it. But still, there was an increasing moral problem regarding the fitness of the heads of the church that were normally appointed, as we've seen by Ottonian tradition, by the same emperors, and this could be a very, let's say, easily weaponizable tool, especially in certain realities, to say, okay, we don't want to be appointed by the emperor. We want to rule each other by ourselves. We want to appoint our own, right? And this was naturally an attempt of autonomization, and this is what also the church altogether, Church of Rome, would do towards the empire. For example, Conrad installed the new bishop of Bâle in 1025 by paying him a considerable amount of money. Right, literally, you wanted to support this guy to settle there without problems, be able to pay for his army, for his territorial control, for enacting some kind of reforms, having still some reserves to cope with previous problems. And in this way, he would feel bound to you, and you could control him in a way. This was considered in a way from the same bishop perspective as a servitium regis. That the churches had basically always, let's say, be accustomed to in a way, because that kind of power had always interfered in ecclesiastical matters, and there was not much of a way for these local clergymen to to rule in their own regard. If they had to be supported by someone or somebody, not just by themselves, or at least it was a very profitable thing to do. And Wipo writes in his Gesta Conradi after 1046, shortly after 1046, that is under Henry Conrad's son and successor Henry III, that the Simoniac heresy, so the one of essentially purchasing of ecclesiastical offices, had literally suddenly appeared when King Conrad II and his queen, by the way, because the queens, were very involved also in this kind of donation, were very powerful, etc. They came from important lineages themselves, so they would act in this sense in the same way. Would have accepted an immense amount of money from the cleric Uldarich upon the latter's installment on the episcopal throne of Basel. That is to say, the king had been corrupted by these cleric to become bishop. And interestingly enough, Wipo writes that Conrad, albeit he actually repented of this sin, at some point vowing never to accept money again for an abbey or a bishopric, albeit the author also adds, and he more or less kept his promise. That is to say, obviously, that things were still going on like that, but that somebody had recriminated about such more evident purchasing of a title. But this is, we can't digress, but it's really important, because these communities naturally were also always divided in a way. There were always two opposed parties, at least, that were competing for each other, and therefore there was always a kind of a bad mood overlapping with dissent towards the emperor, and that could find a fertile soil also in the rest of the kingdom of the empire, with an interconnection that would be surprised by the 11th century on a territorial scale. And surely in the 40s of the 11th century, when Wipo writes, the issue of simony and Nicolaitism, that is, the latter is basically installing a son, basically, in an ecclesiastical office by the fathers that had revested them, were a bit like the punchline, the propagandistic words of the church reformers, right? We made videos about this too, like how did the reform begin. We have a medieval papacy, medieval Christianity playlists. There is, I don't remember the title. It has to do with the Patari as well. That has to do with Italian cities, where this thing began to spread more evenly. There is naturally, we can think that moral standards had changed much, as we've seen. It's just that things such as simony and Nicolaitism were to be seen as an important point to stress in order to underline the injustice existing very often in everything at the time behind this imperial appointment, fundamentally, the corruption behind it. We can't think that the church even cared properly about them in themselves, meaning that even passing, an office from father to son in case of priesthood, etc., was kind of beneficial, because more or less these people had seen what their fathers did. They knew what the church was about, right? It had naturally developed like that. This same kind of gift / corruption, etc., was normal at the time, right? Pre-industrial societies work exclusively through corruption. There is no another way to make it work, right? Nothing ever collapsed because corruption was something particularly more or less than elsewhere, right? Surely this thing existed, but if it crumbled, it was when it met with a more advanced civilization that had a greater degree of statal capacity, right? That already, in this time, by the 11th century, the world was pretty similar, especially in Europe and the Mediterranean. Also, in spite of the ruling Reichskirche, so properly the imperial churches, was, in Ottonian times, carried out, we could say, as a method, right, as an idea of the world, more just in an empire and church. Properly in the canons, as we were recalling before, there was properly nothing about the proper appointment of a bishop, right? The idea is that, as by tradition, as by Roman tradition, since ever in the Christian Church, the bishopric was the bishop was elected by the clergy and the people of the bishopric, right? So that was what mattered, right? And the point is that in these times, still the clerus et populus, as the formula recited, were not, just as we have seen at I don't know, for the election of the German kings, were not conceived as properly an electoral body. You could say, okay, it's these people. It was even during imperial elections in Rome. The idea was that there was the people of Rome there, clapping and and saying, giving green light for the election of the emperor. But we don't have to think of the people of Rome like the loaves seller, the shoemaker. We're talking about the nobility, right? And properly, I wouldn't be surprised if they were in arms at that point. I mean, there was something there that properly was very far from any kind of let's say public and non-private influence in the matter. And actually, imperial authority represented kind of the best public authority you could ask for in that sense. So also there was a sharp difference in this sense in the lay succession. That is to say, any kind of imperial fief, lay fief, had basically to be received by name by the through the hands of the Lord in the feudal hierarchy, right? So the emperor, in theory, had to give green light himself for any kind of lay succession, and we know that even in here it didn't really happen anything like that. It was just a generalized rule to say, okay, that was the imperial prerogative, right? But there was always a struggle, a bitter negotiation to make this happen in a way. So it was kind of impossible to distinguish proper what the moral divide should be about, right? Probably most people didn't even care factually, as we were saying before. But this is exactly what gave further need to regulate this, because the problem often broke up in violence, in feud, right? And the imperial authority was evaluated proper in the capacity to put an end to these struggles, and in a sense also to content those who locally had already the upper hand, right? So it was always a very delicate balance, because what do you do here, right? Yes, you want these people to be fit for office, but do you really have the power for fully deciding or having properly a decisive influence on who's gonna rule at that point? It was evidently not the case most of the cases. So there was still no properly celibacy imposed, as we've seen in that previous video, for the clergy at the time. There was still this connection with also the between the clergy and and this lay power in terms of reciprocal influence of appointments on, and mostly from Ottonian times the emperor had the upper hand. And consider also that, as we were saying before, sometimes the difference between lay and ecclesiastical was not properly perceived. Like, the clergy had knights, retinues. The emperor asked them; they would be interested in operating like that. I mean, it was so heavily and practically connected to the world logics of the empire. It would have been impossible to properly come up one day and say, okay, we can equate this to simony, right? Because by the holy canons, just simply like that. So the roots of the spread of the church, the needs of church, the instances of church reformation are something that go much beyond the problem of the gift exchange economy that was normal to everybody at the time, would kept remaining for a long time. Albeit there is surely an improvement in the same request for a better. So there is a civilizational value in the same Gregorian reforms, in the struggle for investors. I mean, this notoriously in medieval civilization boosted the greatest juridical development, probably comparatively in the history of mankind, considering in relative terms what properly the Middle Ages were about, and how the arrival of Roman law, how it impacted the Holy Roman Empire from a political institutional level. So this must not be taken as it was an hypocritical way of dealing, right? But still it was reflecting the increasing contrasts between ever more powerful communities that up to that point hadn't found like better regulations for systems now that were completely starting to be surpassed by scale and magnitude of proportions of interests, right? So this would bring to a change in perspective of the idea of simony and Nicolaitism, because people were much more careful about to whom power passed and how, right? Because they had better ideas on how it could happen, and not just merely personal interest. That is, okay, basically the same thing at that level, but still it's what civilization fundamentally, thanks God, that works like. Because otherwise, if it was just this kind of moralistic look on history at this point, if all the things that had to go bad all the time, we wouldn't have had even a development, civilizationally speaking. Instead, evidently, this is not the case, right? So there is also this idea of purity of priesthood, unpolluted by money and fleshy contacts, for which otherwise sacraments, delivered by them could have not been, properly good, like, because they were told this would not save your soul, right? If it received from an impure priest. This is something that goes back as far as the late Roman Empire. It's always a bit same issues that pop out in the church at different times, but for reasons that are properly not ecclesiologically rooted, but simply what's politics and society doing at the same time, right? And it's, as we were saying before, this is remarkably a consequence also of the same imperial propaganda, of Ottonian times, that had justified the purification of the church, right, through imperial intervention, right? And this was designed specifically intervening against the Roman aristocracy, properly the aristocracy of the city of Rome, that heavily interfered in the election from which the same popes were drawn, up to that point usually, which interfered in the imperial election, and therefore the most important thing for emperors was to secure, especially the Roman election, imperial election, as you understand. But naturally, this would have gone down the hierarchy as it was forming at this point, even if we're talking pre-Gregorian, therefore papal monarchy times, in all the rest of the church. So this was a huge issue that invested all the cities, all the bishoprics, especially in Italy, as we've seen, but the emperors had enormous interest, but still lesser grip. And the creation of the Ottonian bishop counts, right, in Italy, that is to say, instead of having a count like it had been in Carolingian tradition, that is a lay guy ruling there, it would be just basically the emperor attributing comital power to the bishop, right? And this was especially true in Italy because the bishopric there overlapped very well with properly a urban district, and therefore had its center in the city and in the diocese where that historically had always been the center of power. So it was very convenient in a way. But as we've seen with the rebellions in Lombardy, this thing was starting to take an important political direction, right? Because it was about being like bishop mostly pro-imperial and the rest of the aristocracy usually anti-imperial, right? And so by gross approximation, what you see with the rise of the communes is properly that aristocracy at the end of the day trying to oust bishop power, or at least to seize it, actually, because communes were often acting in the wake of episcopal authority, exactly because it was comital authority, exactly because it had been provided by the emperor, right? They went by the book, namely, right? But doing something also very eccentric, very unusual, and actually quite original, to say the least, for what the order had been in this regard. In fact, what is important to stress here is that this concern for simony and Nicolaitism was mostly a northern Italian thing, right? It belonged to specific religious circles that were, interested in contexting at that point a certain specific authority in the cities. And this goes in parallel between the 10th and 11th century with the appearance of some properly religious persecutions, right, that were something rare in early medieval times and would become more in late medieval times, even more in modern age in part. Because, I don't know, think about witch hunting. It was mostly a modern history thing, not a medieval history thing, but still, anyhow. And interestingly enough, it's essentially from, well, okay, we can't digress in here, but say that where it began first, it ended first. Interestingly enough, so this is not even just, that's where they start doing the thing first, so it's because they are different and they will keep doing the thing. No. Those places too, because mostly these practices, not witch hunting, because if this was witch hunting, it's probably heretical pursuit, is, the product, actually in any culture and civilization, this happened unfortunately everywhere, of, societies that start to regulate themselves in ways for which orthodoxy has to maintain a control on society, which is beneficial to the same society, because society itself demands for it. I don't know, even the Romans had some kind of witch hunting, but nobody knows that, because we've been told the story that the ancient world, the pagan world, was tolerant. That's bullshit. Right, let's be honest about look at history of civilizations and let's see what concretely happened. Once again, it's like those that complain about the medieval obscurantism of the church, and then you have witches burned in New England by the 18th century, where nobody in the papal career would have ever dreamt by the 16th to think that burning a woman for witchcraft was a thing, or that the terrible West with the church, and then in Russia you had pogroms of Jews in mass for until the 19th century, 20th. I mean, we're talking about really civilizational developments that cannot be compared, and it's like sometimes disturbing even to see the complete moral disorientation in front of these phenomena. But aside from that, last heretical concerns were mostly from late Roman period. Here, Europe is reawakening. It's becoming more intelligent, more dynamic, more capable. So they need to more strict rules properly, right? When the Decretum of Burgard of Worms was compiled around 1025, nobody, there was nothing in there about heretics, right? But just as about the same time, you find the Milanese historian Landulf writing that his Archbishop of Milan, Aribert of Intiman, having discovered a group of heretics living in the castle of the Countess of Monteforte near Turin, he interrogated them. They confessed to an extremely ascetic life, which is dramatically similar to all the Neoplatonic, in fact, normally heterodox currents, as would be also the ones of the Catars later, the Bogomils and other, even in Islam, you have basically the same thing. There is basically an Aristotelian, here Western Europe is still far from Aristotle, but I don't know, in Islam it was like an Aristotelian orthodoxy and a fringe of Neoplatonic extremism. It was always like that, more or less, and that would be the same with the construction of the papal monarchy, right? And these guys, what did they confess? They confessed an extremely ascetic life, continuous prayers, vigils, declining personal property. So it's always saying things, some kind of communistic ideals. Even sexual intercourse and everything fleshly. So this is the damnation of the flesh and of the, yeah, it's always the essentially Gnostic heresy, right? This kind of almost schizophrenic. There is no way, also historically, psychologically speaking, to define this historical process. That is not really a civilizational value, because I cannot think of how everything fleshy or even sexual intercourse is something, to be forbidden from a mentally healthy person. So if you wonder, these were the heretics, and you say, wait a second, but, weren't the churchmen the sexually repressed freaks? Well, no. And unfortunately, this is something that even at the time was surely responding to a criticism toward the church in that sense, because they say, but churchmen can have children. Why is that? This goes all along with, and you see even here sometimes the fact that the instances of reformation of the church were exactly the ones for which eventually the church was actually reformed, but that it couldn't enforce to the extreme. Right, that is to say, I still have to maintain a church. Do you have realized what it means by the 11th century to build a papal monarchy? And so you need some discipline at some level, but from the others you have to control power. And this is not done by ideal or hippie, mindset of how, authority must work factually, and you need some kind of repression if you want a democratic society in the first place, because otherwise it's just chaos. Right, and especially who complains about this has not the slightest idea, even fortunately, how to make things work. I mean, look at all revolutionary movements. What happened when they actually arrived to power, historically, when the fringe arrived? They all became orthodox in the end. They were even more repressive than before, more cruel, less intelligent, and dramatically, intolerant, as they were complaining about. And that is one of the great problems of extremisms, for that always represent themselves historically in the same way. These heretics, probably the thing that were they declined more, and that brought them to be sentenced, was that they denied the sacraments. Is another typical Gnostic trait, and the authority of the Roman pontiff. Like, we could overlap this to the Cathars of 200 years later, right? Look, the video we made on the Cathars that were absolutely not tolerant free thinkers of any sort, were actually an exact copy of the Church of Rome, including with their own Inquisition and their own persecution. It was something atrocious. Even the Valdensians backed Rome to say, okay, let's take these guys out because they're freaking crazy with this kind of background. But the thing is a bit different, because seemingly the Cathars as such never existed. That is to say, most people were considered Cathars were actually Catholic. They were just trying to autonomize themselves politically as Occitanians from the French papal grip, right? Which is a different thing, but still big deal in terms of civilizational unity, which is what mostly we praise the Middle Ages for, and that did come at a cost, but also with some benefit that, in my humble opinion, superseded it. So what Alberto Vintimian actually took them prisoners to Milan, and he could not himself prevent the leading citizens of the city to burn to death those who had refused to confess the Catholic faith. Right? Always remember this, that the Inquisition is not that this was not Inquisition, but the practices are actually worse, and this is the people, right? Things like Inquisition were created by demand of the majority of the people. They weren't imposed by the evil guys, right? The church was among the most guarantistic systems at the time. Lay authority was much more brutal. It killed without proofs. It brought you. They could do whatever the hell they liked. The church actually posed itself the problem, saying, "Okay, we have to make this also a moral matter. It can't be a okay." So they often surpassed in capacity those who were actually seeking for a reform about the same accomplishments of the reform. This is one of the earliest medieval cases where people were put to death by their own fellow Christians because of their divergent religious practice. This shows by the pen of Landulf how there were, let's say, kind of mass movements. Look at the Bataria, for example. That's where I made a video about. That were here. It's northern Italy, but it's really all over Western Europe at this point. At the end of the, here we are, at the beginning of the 11th century, and that a bit before, that was seeking for like kind of regulation of the church. They the people of Milan burnt these people down, not even the bishop. So probably people were concerned about what the church could be about from an organizational point of view, because they realized it could back also a political unity, political stability that was starting to take other paths, right? It's like, I don't want to turn this video into, a comparison with, more of, say, moral issues, it's the history of the church, etc. It was what about Conrad. But it's still very important to see eventually what the Salians would undergo because of these movements, because it's a moment of blossoming of Europe, right? It's not a case that an episode like this would take place in Milan, because these were some of the most economically thriving centers. So wherever that happens, civilization needs more regulation. And that's why we praise liberty and not freedom as a civilizational value. Because we're rational beings. We're not animals, right? And yes, it does pass, considering that it's the 11th century. What said, well, they burned these people at the stake for their beliefs. Yes, they did. But don't think that today we don't kill people in this way, in other ways that are less brutal, but actually bring to losses, right? And the same kind, or that in these times we are not facing something similar to that. That is to say, a moment of great booming for which we don't have still the rules set properly, right? The Middle Ages have a lot to teach us, even if modern mind is not really habituated to think so, right? Modernity is beautiful. We are product of that. It's not even a matter of liking it or not. We are in it, and there has been an actual improvement, but certain things are, like, the progress is non-linear. So never think that we got modernity and that comes without a cost. We have to prove we are worth it. Right? And those guys in the Middle Ages were already much more modern than we think, and capable of solving problems, exactly because they were exposed to the lack of regulation, and they felt it, and they had to create it from scratch, and that's where we built on eventually, as moderns as well. So speaking of Conrad and what was happening in Italy or France, where we can't say that in Germany properly. We can't be fairly certain about this. They didn't really care about that. Like, there was, as we've seen, Germany was still kind of fairly isolated area, right? It was interconnected importantly, but still, it didn't have the, let's say the moral material resources to engage in what was happening in France or Italy, as far as especially these movements were concerned. It wouldn't be understood, because an Eastern Frankish devotion at that point was mostly traditional, even in imperial milieu, right? They were all about, the elite making pious gifts to monasteries and churches. It was still, if you want, still a kind of I don't know how to say in English, evangelizational kind of mentality, where we can imagine in early 11th century Germany. Were there pagans still there? Yeah, yeah, there would be for the world Middle Ages, for that matter. Okay, not the majority, of course, but still, what do you think that an 11th century German peasant actually believed about Christianity? Right? Could they care about what was happening at the elite level, in the churches of Italy, whatever? Never even seen a city in their life. Well, of course not. But this, in part, also spared the country from other strains in a way. And the word the memoria, the mass for the dead, held in prayers, for the well-being of the living and of the dead. let's say, there was still in this gradual construction, for example, the burial or by a church near to the holy relics was promoted for salvation matters. Still, this idea of magic, of power, this also existed in paganism. I get closer to the source of sanctity. So I feel, well, if you look in Rome and the Vatican catacombs, you see that the tomb of Peter is like, there are lots of other coffins all around, because all the nobility were to be buried there to receive the sanctity of the Peter's remains. So we're talking about 11th century. We can't reason as if we were us now judging that. There was no other principle, no other idea, no other belief before that. And still Christianity was largely, also kind of adapting to certain realities as well that were not properly, they didn't constitute a threat, intellectually to, paganism never had stood a chance. But the properly also couldn't quite be changed because there were different levels, so the church itself in part didn't even care, right? Conrad II is very important. He built, he chose the Episcopal Church of Speyer to be his own family's resting place. We started a long tradition of imperial burials. You find lots for German rulers buried there, and started the construction, in fact, of what would be, I don't know if you ever been to Speyer, but it was one of the most impressive Romanesque cathedrals in Germany at the time, and that is still a very important place of culture, I would say, in European history. A trip to Speyer, definitely a gift that you can make to yourself, and to understand properly the graduality of the creation, the evolution of a principle of royalty, of power, of rule, and that went through the storms of this troubled times, as we will see better, especially when we'll talk about other, well, for the Salians, Henry IV, definitely. But, nobody had it easy at this time, right? Whichever ruler was always one step away to be overthrown in any situation, and that's what brought people to seek for further stabilization. All right, a bit cerebral maybe for an introduction to Conrad II, but I hope it's a bit of a panorama of the situation in the empire. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.